I had this moment this morning that was completely mundane, just entirely routine, yet it sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole.
Oh, yeah. What happened?
I was just opening a letter, bills, unfortunately, and I got a paper cut.
The worst.
Right. Just a tiny, annoying slice right on the pad of my thumb. And I did what we all do. I swore a little bit, squeezed it, stuck a Band-Aid on it, and went right back to my coffee.
Naturally.
But then I stopped. I looked at that little Band-Aid and realized I was taking something absolutely massive for granted.
You're talking about the fact that you didn't just, bleed out from a paper cut.
Exactly. We take it completely for granted that the bleeding just stops. We assume our bodies just handle it. But if you actually zoom in, if you look at the biology of that exact moment the paper sliced the skin, it is not just stopping. It is a massive, high-stakes, rapid response emergency operation happening at a microscopic level.
It really is. It's like a specialized SWAT team descending on a breach in a fortress wall.
Yes. And it's one of those survival mechanisms that is so efficient, we completely ignore it until it fails.
Right. And when we talk about hemostasis, which is the technical medical term for keeping the blood inside the vessel, we are talking about what is arguably the most complex balancing act in human physiology.
And that is exactly what we are diving into today. We are looking at the delicate balance, a deep dive into hemostasis. Now, for the listener, I want to set the scene here. We aren't just riffing. We have a stack of incredibly detailed source material right in front of us.
Oh, yeah. We've got comprehensive reviews of hematology flashcards, complex charts covering coagulation pathways, tables comparing platelet disorders, and deep dives into lab testing protocols.
The sources are fantastic because they strip away all the fluff. This isn't some generalized summary. We're looking at the raw data, the charts detailing coagulation factors, the Roman numeral soup, and the diagrams of the clotting cascade that medical students and hematologists literally use to memorize this stuff.
It's the user manual for how you stay alive.
And our mission today is to decode that manual. We want to understand that Roman numeral soup of clotting factors. We want to figure out the difference between the map we use in the lab versus the actual biological territory inside your veins. And we're going to play detective with some of these bleeding disorders.
I love the detective analogy because hematology really is forensic work. You're looking at the clues left behind by the blood.
But the main theme, as you mentioned, is balance. Because as I was reading through these charts, I realized the blood has to do two completely contradictory things at the exact same time, doesn't it?
That is the central paradox of your circulatory system. Think about it. On one hand, your blood has to flow freely. It needs to be a liquid, low viscosity, zooming around your body at high speeds to deliver oxygen to your brain, your heart, your toes.
So if it thickens up even a little bit when it shouldn't...
You're in serious trouble. But then the instant, and I mean the literal split second, there's an injury, like your paper cut. It has to change its state of matter.
It has to go from a flowing liquid to a solid rock.
Right. And it has to do it locally, only at the site of the injury, and it has to do it instantly.
And if it clots too much...
You die from thrombosis. A clot blocks a vessel in your heart, that's a heart attack. In your brain, that's a stroke. In your lungs, it's a pulmonary embolism.
And if it clots too little...
You bleed to death. Hemorrhage.
So basically, we are walking a tightrope every single second of our lives. No pressure.
None at all. Just a perfect equilibrium required 24/7. And the amazing thing is, for most of us, this system works flawlessly for 80 or 90 years without us ever dedicating a single conscious thought to it.
Now, let's stop taking it for granted and start unpacking it. Let's go back to the scene of the crime. My paper cut. The vessel is breached. Blood is starting to escape. Who are the very first responders?
So before we even get to the chemistry, before we get to the clotting proteins, the body has an immediate physical reaction. The very first thing listed in our overview of primary hemostasis is vasoconstriction.
The vessel itself fights back.
Exactly. The muscular walls of the blood vessel spasm and clamp down.
Right.
It shrinks the diameter of the tube to minimize the flow of blood to the injured area. It's essentially pinching the garden hose.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Less flow means less blood loss.
Right. But that's just a stopgap. You can't pinch the hose forever. You need to patch the hole. So the real work of primary hemostasis begins with the platelets.
The bricks of the wall.
That's a really great way to picture them. Platelets are these tiny cell fragments circulating in your blood. They aren't full cells. They don't even have a nucleus. But they're packed with granules and mechanical machinery. In our source material, the sequence of their action is described in 3 distinct steps.
Okay, lay them out.
Vasoconstriction, which we mentioned, then platelet adhesion, and finally platelet aggregation.
Okay, I want to pause there and really drill down on this because adhesion and aggregation sound like synonyms to a layperson. But looking at these flashcards, in this context, they are two very different mechanics.
It is a crucial difference. If you mix them up, you can't understand the diseases we're going to talk about. Adhesion is the platelets sticking to the site of the injury itself. When a vessel is cut, the inner lining is broken, and collagen, which is usually hidden underneath, is exposed to the blood.
So they see the exposed piping.
Exactly. Platelets stick to that collagen. That is adhesion, sticking to the wall.
Okay, so adhesion is sticking to the floor. What is aggregation?
Aggregation is when the platelets stick to each other. They pile on top of the ones that are already stuck to the wall to build up a massive pluck.
So adhesion is the foundation, aggregation is building the skyscraper.
Precisely. But here is where it gets highly technical and really fascinating. They can't just stick by magic. They aren't naturally sticky or they'd clot all the time inside healthy veins. They need glue, and they need special receptors. Think of them like specific Velcro hooks that only pop out when they are needed.
This is where we get into the alphabet soup of receptors on the charts. I see GPIB and GPIBIA. Let's break those down, because looking at the disorders section, this seems to be exactly where things go wrong in genetic diseases.
Right. Let's look at the first step, adhesion. The receptor on the platelet surface responsible for this is called GPIB, glycoprotein 1b. Actually, it's a complex called GPIBIXV, but GPIB is the main player everyone focuses on.
Okay, so the platelet has this hook called GPIB. What does it hook onto? Does it grab the collagen directly?
No, and this is a really key point in the source material. It needs a bridge. It connects to a massive protein floating in the blood called von Willebrand factor, or VWF.
I see VWF mentioned everywhere in these notes. It seems to be the MVP of clotting.
It is the primary glue. Think of VWF like a piece of double-sided tape. One side of the VWF binds to the exposed collagen in the wound. The other side just waits for a platelet to fly by.
Catching it like a fly in a web.
Exactly. When the platelet comes along, its GPI receptor grabs onto the VWF. That anchors the platelet to the wall.
So without von Willebrand factor, the platelet just slides right past the hole like a car on ice.
Yes, and the condition is von Willebrand disease, which we'll discuss in detail later. But let's look at the receptor itself for a second. What if you have plenty of the glue, the VWF, but your platelet is missing the hook, the GPI?
And you still can't stick.
Correct. And that specific failure, missing the GPI receptor entirely, is a disease called Bernard-Soulier syndrome.
I saw that on the qualitative platelet disorders card. It says key features are giant platelets and abnormal adhesion. Why giant platelets? Is that just a weird side effect of the broken hook?
It's a hallmark of the disease. Because the platelets aren't being made or processed correctly in the bone marrow, the body pumps out these massive, immature forms. Normal platelets are tiny specks. In Bernard-Soulier, if you look at our microscope, the platelets can be as big as red blood cells.
So if I'm a lab tech and I see a giant platelet and the patient is bleeding, I'm thinking Bernard-Soulier.
You're definitely putting it at the top of your list.
Okay, so that's adhesion. Sticking to the wall using GPIB and von Willebrand factor. Now, what about the other one? Aggregation. The notes mention GPIBIA.
This is the second hook. Once the platelets are stuck to the wall, they get activated. They physically change shape. They go from smooth little discs to spiky little sea urchins, and they activate this second receptor, GPIBIA.
And what does this hook grab?
It grabs fibrinogen. Now, fibrinogen is another protein floating in the blood. It acts like a bridge between two different platelets. One platelet grabs one end of the fibrinogen with its GPIBIA receptor, and another platelet grabs the other end with its receptor.
So fibrinogen is holding hands with two platelets, locking them together.
Exactly. And then another platelet grabs on, and another, and another. That is aggregation.
And I'm guessing there's a disease if you're missing the second receptor too.
You guessed right. If you are missing the GPIBA receptor, you have a condition called Glanzmann's thrombasthenia.
And the card notes for Glanzmann say, fibrinogen can't attach to platelet surface and initiate platelet aggregation.
Right, so let's contrast them to keep it straight. In Bernard-Soulier, you lack GPIB, so you can't start the wall. You fail at adhesion. In Glanzmann's, you have GPI, so you can start the wall, but you lack GPIB, so you can't build it up. You fail at aggregation.
Both result in serious bleeding, but the mechanical failure is totally different.
Exactly. It's the difference between bad foundation and bad scaffolding.
It's amazing how specific these failures are. It's not just bad blood. It's missing Velcro hook type A or missing Velcro hook type B. And I assume we can test for this differentiation in the lab.
We can. Historically, we used the bleeding time test, which was Well, pretty primitive.
How so?
We literally made a standardized cut on the patient's arm with a scalpel or a lancet and timed how long it took to stop bleeding using filter paper.
That sounds incredibly unpleasant and a bit messy for a modern lab.
It was very messy and hard to standardize. It's largely replaced now by the PFA, the platelet function assay. It's a machine that simulates a cut. It sucks blood through a microscopic hole coated with collagen and other agonists. We measure how long it takes for the hole to plug up, which gives us the closure time.
And how do we use that to tell the difference between Bernard-Soulier and Glanzmann's?
We use different agonists or chemical triggers to see what works and what doesn't. The classic differentiator involves a substance called ristocetin.
Ristocetin. Okay, what does that do?
Ristocetin artificially forces platelets to bind to VWF.
Okay, I think I see where this is going.
So in Bernard-Soulier syndrome, where the VWF receptor is missing, ristocetin aggregation is abnormal. It flat out doesn't work. The hook isn't there for the drug to force together. But in Glanzmann's, where the VWF receptor is perfectly fine, ristocetin aggregation is normal.
And if you use a different trigger?
Conversely, if you use ADP or collagen to trigger aggregation, Glanzmann's platelets fail completely because they can't bind fibrinogen, but Bernard-Soulier platelets might show some normal response.
It's a literal logic puzzle. You poke the system with different sticks to see which part doesn't twitch.
That is pathology in a nutshell.
Before we leave the platelets entirely, we need to talk about numbers. Because sometimes the machinery, the hooks, and the glue is perfectly fine, but you just don't have enough bricks.
Right, those are the quantitative disorders. We count platelets in the millions per liter, but for simplicity in the lab, we use the shorthand per microliter. A normal platelet count is roughly 150,000 to 450,000.
So if it drops below 150,000, that's thrombocytopenia.
Yes. But here is where the balance concept is really interesting. You have a massive safety margin built in. If your count drops to 140,000, nothing happens. If you drop to 100,000, usually nothing happens. The body is incredibly resilient.
The source notes say that clinical signs like petechiae, those tiny red dots that look like a rash but are actually broken capillaries, don't usually appear until the count drops below 30,000.
30,000.
Yeah.
That's a massive drop from 150,000. That shows you how redundant the system is. But once you hit 30,000, you start seeing those pinprick bleeds. The tiny vessels under the skin just start leaking. And if you drop below 10,000,
that's the danger zone.
That is the spontaneous hemorrhage zone. At that level, you could bleed into your brain, your gut, or your joints without any injury at all. That is a critical medical emergency.
The source lists a few reasons for low platelets. Decreased production seems obvious. If the factory, the bone marrow, is broken, like in aplastic anemia or leukemia, you just don't get platelets.
Right. But increased destruction is also very common. This is where your body makes them perfectly fine, but something destroys them immediately once they hit the bloodstream.
It's like ITP.
Immune thrombocytopenic purpura. Your immune system gets confused, decides your own platelets are a foreign enemy, and eats them. Or the spleen, which acts like a blood filter, can get too aggressive and hoard them. That's called sequestration.
On the flip side, you can have way too many. Thrombocytosis.
Which can be a primary genetic disorder, like essential thrombocythemia, where the marrow just churns them out uncontrolled, ignoring all stop signals. Or it can be secondary, which we call reactive. If you have a major surgery or massive bleed, your body panics and orders extra bricks. You might see counts shoot up to 1 million.
Okay, so that's the bricks. That's primary hemostasis. We have a platelet plug, but the source calls it the primary hemostatic plug. It implies there's a secondary one.
Yes, the platelet plug is temporary. Think of it like sticking your thumb in a hole in a dike, or maybe packing loose mud into a crack. It stops the immediate flow, but it's not stable. If you just walked away now, the high pressure of the blood flow from the heart would eventually wash it right away.
You need to seal it.
You need to turn that mud into concrete.
Enter secondary hemostasis. And enter the dreaded Roman numerals.
The coagulation cascade. This is exactly where medical students usually start sweating and crying.
I can see why. I'm looking at this list. Factor I, 3, 3, 4, V7, all the way to 13th. First of all, why are they Roman numerals? It feels very archaic for modern medicine.
It is archaic. And it's confusing because they were numbered in the exact order they were discovered by scientists, not the order they actually act in the body.
That perfectly explains why factor 12 comes before factor abelivin in the pathway.
Exactly. If you try to learn them numerically, you will absolutely lose your mind. 12 activates 11, which activates 9. Where did 10 go? It's a mess. But if we categorize them by function, as our source does here on page 347, it makes way more sense.
Yep.
We have three main categories: substrates, cofactors, and enzymes.
Let's break that down. Substrate. This is the raw material.
Yes, the substance being changed by the chemical reaction. The main one you care about is factor I, also known as fibrinogen.
Oh, we met him earlier. He was the bridge between platelets holding hands.
He was. But in secondary hemostasis, fibrinogen is the absolute star of the show. The whole goal of this entire Rube Goldberg machine, all these complex interactions of factors, has one single purpose: to turn fibrinogen, which is liquid and soluble, into fibrin, which is a solid, insoluble mesh.
So fibrin is the net that goes over the platelet plug and hardens it.
Precisely. It weaves through the platelets and locks them down.
Okay, so factor I, fibrinogen, is the goal. Who does the actual work to change it?
The enzymes. These are mostly serine proteases. Think of them as chemical scissors. They circulate in your blood in an inactive form, like a zymogen. They just float around harmlessly. But when they get the signal, they activate, which is denoted by a little lowercase a next to the Roman numeral. Their job is to cut the next protein in line to activate it.
And who is the boss enzyme? The final set of scissors.
Thrombin. Factor hibrinid. Thrombin is the one that actually cuts fibrinogen into fibrinogen. It is the most important enzyme in the entire hemostatic system.
So we have the raw material, fibrinogen, and the scissors, thrombin. What are the cofactors?
They are the helpers, the accelerators. The source highlights factor V and factor VIII.
Why do enzymes need helpers? If the scissors work, why not just let them cut?
Because without them, the reaction is far too slow to save your life. Imagine trying to cut a piece of paper with scissors, but you have to hold the paper, hold the scissors, and hold a flashlight to see what you're doing all at once.
It would be clumsy.
Right. The cofactor holds the paper and the flashlight for you. Factor V helps factor X. Factor VIII helps factor 9X. With the cofactors holding everything in place on the platelet surface, the reaction happens thousands of times faster. Without them, you bleed.
I noticed another grouping in the charts that seems super important for anyone taking medication, specifically older folks on blood thinners, the vitamin K group.
Huge. Crucially important. Factors 2, 7, 9X, and X. Everyone in hematology memorizes that group. 2, 7, 9, 10. These factors are special because the liver requires vitamin K to synthesize them correctly.
Why does that matter so much?
Because the most common oral blood thinner in the world, Coumadin, or warfarin, is a vitamin K antagonist. It works by sabotaging the recycling of vitamin K in the liver.
So if you take warfarin, you essentially starve the liver of the vitamin K. It needs to make these 4 specific factors.
Well, the liver still makes the protein, but it makes a dud version of it. Without vitamin K, factors 2, 7, 9, and 10 cannot bind calcium. And if they can't bind calcium, they can't bind to the platelet surface. They are functionally useless.
So you're essentially thinning the blood by making these specific factors defective.
Yeah.
That totally explains why people on warfarin have to constantly watch how much spinach and kale they eat.
Exactly. Dark leafy greens, like spinach, are loaded with vitamin K. If you eat a huge salad, you are giving your liver the exact antidote to the drug you're taking. You're restocking the supply, the liver makes functional factors again, and your blood will clot.
Now let's talk about the oddballs in this chart, the contact group. Factor 12, factor XLV, prekallikrein or PK, and high molecular weight kininogen, HMWK.
The contact group is both fascinating and incredibly confusing for students.
The source says something really weird about them right off the bat. It says deficiencies in factor 12, PK, and HMWK cause no bleeding.
Let that sink in for a second. You
Yeah.
could be completely missing factor 12, which is also called Hagman factor, and you will not bleed abnormally. You could have major open heart surgery, and your clotting would be clinically totally fine.
But I'm looking at the diagram. It's right there at the very top of the intrinsic pathway. The chart clearly says factor 12 activates factor 11. If factor 12 is missing, the first domino shouldn't fall, and the clotting shouldn't happen.
And this brings us perfectly to part 3 of our dive, the map versus the territory.
The clash of the theories.
Exactly. We have 2 models of coagulation in our source material. Model A is the cascade model. This is the classic Y-shaped diagram everyone learns in medical school.
Left arm, right arm, meeting in the middle.
Right. You have the intrinsic pathway on one side, that's 12, 11, 9, 8. You have the extrinsic pathway on the other side, that's tissue factor and 7, and they merge into the common pathway. 10, 5, 2, 1.
And this model relies entirely on factor 12 starting the intrinsic side.
Correct. And here is the absolute key to understanding this. In a test tube, in the sterile environment of a lab, this model is perfect. If you put blood in a glass tube, the negative charge of the glass itself activates factor 12. Factor 12 sets off the chain and the blood clots. If you lack factor 12, the blood in the glass tube will not clot.
So the lab test, the APTT, will be abnormal.
Extremely abnormal. It will look like you have no clotting ability at all. The timer will just keep running.
But the patient doesn't bleed in real life.
Which means the map is wrong. Or at least the map is not the territory. The cascade model perfectly explains the lab tests, but it completely fails to explain the human body. Because inside the body, we don't have glass tubes.
We don't have negatively charged glass inside our veins.
Exactly. So what starts the process?
Right. So what is the better model? How does it actually work inside us?
That is Model B, the cell-based or physiological model. This is the modern, accurate understanding. It doesn't see pathways as separate arms of a Y. It sees three overlapping phases happening on cell surfaces: initiation, amplification, and propagation.
And looking at the diagram for Model B, it focuses really heavily on those cell surfaces.
Yes. It says clotting happens on surfaces, specifically the tissue factor-bearing cell, like a fibroblast outside the vessel, and the activated platelet.
So walk us through this cell-based view. How does it start, if not with factor 12 hitting glass?
Phase 1 is initiation. A vessel breaks. Blood leaks out of the tube and touches a cell outside the vessel, maybe a muscle cell or a fibroblast that has a protein called tissue factor on it. Factor 7 from the blood binds to that tissue factor.
So tissue factor and factor 7 meet up.
They hug. And that specific interaction creates a tiny spark, a tiny, tiny amount of thrombin.
Just a spark. Not enough to create a massive fibrin clot yet.
No, nowhere near enough. But it is enough to start phase 2, amplification. That tiny bit of thrombin floats over to the nearby platelets and wakes them up. It activates the platelets, and it activates the cofactors, factor V and factor 8. It primes the bomb.
And phase 3?
Propagation. This happens on the surface of the now activated platelet. Because the cofactors, 5 and 8, are ready and holding the flashlights, the enzymes, 9 and 10, can work at maximum speed. This leads to a massive thrombin burst. Huge, large-scale production of thrombin, which instantly converts all nearby fibrinogen to fibrin.
Boom! Clot form.
Boom! The dike is sealed with concrete.
And here is the major aha moment regarding factor 12. In this cell-based model, where does factor IBN come from?
In the cell-based model, factor IBN is activated by thrombin, that initial spark from phase 1. It is not activated by factor 12.
So the body bypasses factor 12 entirely. Thrombin loops back and activates the boosters itself.
Exactly. Factor 12, PK, and HMWK are essentially artifacts of the test tube. They are needed to start clotting on artificial glass surfaces, which we call contact activation. But in the body, the tissue factor pathway starts everything, and thrombin reinforces it.
That is wildly cool. It effectively means we have a standard everyday lab test, the APTT, that tests for a protein that doesn't even matter for human bleeding.
It matters for other things. Factor 12 is involved in inflammation and fighting bacteria, but for hemostasis, not really. But we still panic in the hospital when the APTT is high until we do the detective work, figure out it's just factor 12 deficiency, and tell the surgeon, it's fine, cut him open, he won't bleed.
Okay, speaking of tests, let's open the detective kit. We've got the PT and the APTT. These are the bread and butter of the coagulation lab.
They are. And even though they are based on the old cascade model, they are vital for monitoring patients and screening for severe diseases.
So let's look at the PT first, prothrombin time.
The PT measures the extrinsic and common pathways. That means it's looking specifically at factor 7, X, V2, and I.
I use the memory trick, play tennis. PT extrinsic, because tennis is played outside extrinsic.
That's a classic mnemonic.
Yeah.
It works perfectly. And because it looks at factor 7 and the vitamin K boys.
It is the primary test for monitoring Coumadin, warfarin.
Right. Remember, warfarin hits factor 7 first because factor 7 has the shortest half-life in the blood. It disappears fastest. The PT detects that drop in 7 very quickly.
And we don't just report the time in seconds, do we? We use this thing called INR.
Right. This was a huge problem historically in medicine. Different labs use different reagents, different thromboplastins made from rabbit brains or recombinant tissue. A PT of 14 seconds in my lab might be the exact same biologically as 18 seconds in your lab across town. It was a complete mess for dosing patients.
So they did some math?
They developed the International Normalized Ratio, the INR. It standardizes the result using a mathematical sensitivity index. So an INR of 2.0 in New York is the exact same biological blood thinness as an INR of 2.0 in London.
What's a normal target?
For a normal, healthy person, the INR is around 1.0. For a patient on blood thinners for, say, atrial fibrillation, usually we want them between 2.0 and 3.0. If you are at 1.0, you aren't thin, so you have a risk of stroke. If you are at 5.0, your blood is way too thin, and you have a risk of severe bleeding.
Then we have the other big one, the APTT, activated partial thromboplastin time.
This measures the intrinsic and common pathways. Factors 12, ELM9, 8, XV2, and I. Essentially everything except factor 7.
And this is used to monitor.
Unfractionated heparin. Heparin works entirely differently than warfarin. It works by accelerating a natural protein called antithrombin. Antithrombin neutralizes the serine proteases, mostly thrombin and factors Asia. The APTT is extremely sensitive to this inhibition.
So let's do a logic check based on the charts. If I have a patient with a long APTT but a totally normal PT, what does that tell me?
It tells you the problem is completely isolated to the intrinsic pathway. It has to be 12, 11, 9, or 8. Because if it were in the common pathway, 10, 5, or 2, both tests would be long because they share that pathway.
That's good logic. It narrows the suspect list down to 4 people immediately. But here's a scenario the source describes that is tricky. You have a patient with a long APTT. You suspect a factor deficiency, maybe hemophilia, but what if it's something else? What if it's an inhibitor?
The mixing study. This is a classic lab logic puzzle we need to know. Is the patient simply missing a factor, like their body doesn't make it, or do they make it, but they have a rogue antibody attacking the factors?
How do you tell?
You take the patient's plasma, which is abnormal, and you mix it 1-to-1 with normal plasma, a standardized product we buy, which we know has all the factors at 100%.
So you're pouring good soup into the bad soup.
Ideally, if the patient was simply missing a factor, say they have hemophilia and lack factor 8, the normal plasma you just added acts as a refill. It has plenty of factor 8. So when you run the APTT test again on the new mixture, the time should correct to normal.
Correction equals deficiency. The good soup fixed it.
Right. But if the patient has an inhibitor, like a nasty autoantibody circulating in their blood,
The antibody is still there in the mix.
and it viciously attacks the fresh plasma you just added, it eats up all the factors in the normal plasma too. So when you run the test, the mixture will still be prolonged. It does not correct.
No correction equals inhibitor. That is so incredibly elegant.
It really is. It separates the 2 main categories of bleeding problems immediately, and it changes the entire treatment plan for the doctor.
One more specific test in the kit that caught my eye, the reptilase time. This involves snake venom.
It does. Reptilase is an enzyme derived from the venom of the Bothrop's atrox pit viper.
Metal. Just straight up venom in the lab.
Very. It's functionally similar to thrombin. It converts fibrinogen to fibrin. But here's the kicker. Heparin blocks thrombin. But heparin cannot block reptilase. The snake venom is completely immune to heparin's effects.
Why is that useful diagnostically?
Imagine you have a sample with a super long thrombin time, the TT test. You suspect it might be heparin contamination. Maybe the nurse accidentally drew blood from an IV line that had a heparin flush lock in it.
Which happens all the time in hospitals.
It does. It's a very common error.
Yeah.
So you run a reptilase time on that same sample. If the reptilase time is perfectly normal, then you know the problem was heparin. Because the venom worked fine, it ignored the heparin, but the human thrombin failed because it was blocked by heparin.
But if the reptilase time was also long,
Then the problem is the fibrinogen itself, the raw material, because the venom couldn't clot it either. It proves the bricks themselves are defective or missing entirely.
genius. Using nature's toxins as diagnostic tools to bypass modern pharmaceutical drugs.
It's brilliant science.
Let's move to part 5. When the system fails. We've talked about the mechanics, now let's talk about the diseases. The source lists inherited and acquired disorders. Let's start with inherited.
The big one for inherited, aside from the platelet ones like Bernard-Shoulier we discussed, is von Willebrand disease, VWD.
It says here it's the most common inherited bleeding disorder in the world.
It is. Remember we talked about the glue, VWF. If you don't have enough of it, or if you make a defective version, your platelets can't adhere to the wound.
But the lab findings listed here are interesting. Platelet count is normal. PT is normal. But the APTT can be normal or prolonged. Why would the APTT be long? VWF isn't in the spiral staircase of the intrinsic pathway, is it?
But VWF has a side hustle. It has a crucial second job. It's not just glue for platelets. It is also the carrier protein, the Uber driver, for factor 8.
Factor 8, the hemophilia factor.
Yes. Factor 8 is highly unstable on its own. It degrades rapidly in the bloodstream. It needs VWF to carry it around and protect it from degrading. If you lack VWF, your factor VIII has no ride. It gets broken down. So a patient with severe VWD will often have very low factor VIII levels as a secondary effect.
Which makes the APTT long, because factor VIII is a key part of that intrinsic pathway.
Exactly. Which makes severe VWD look an awful lot like hemophilia A on paper.
So how do you tell them apart?
First, you look at genetics. Hemophilia A is sex-linked recessive. It sits on the X chromosome, so it primarily affects males. VWD is autosomal dominant. It affects men and women equally.
And clinically, presenting symptoms.
VWD is usually mucocutaneous bleeding. Nosebleeds, heavy menstrual periods, gum bleeding when brushing teeth. Hemophilia A involves deep bleeding, bleeding into joints, which is called hemarthrosis, and deep muscle bleeds. That's a key differentiator. If a young boy comes into the ER with a swollen, blood-filled knee, you think hemophilia. If a young woman comes in with unmanageably heavy periods and frequent nosebleeds, you think VWD.
And hemophilia B.
That is Christmas disease, named after the very first patient diagnosed with it, a boy receiving Christmas, in 1952.
Oh, not the holiday.
Not the holiday. It is factor IX deficiency. Clinically, it looks exactly like hemophilia A. Same deep joint bleeding, same sex-linked inheritance pattern. You literally cannot tell them apart clinically without doing a specific factor assay in the lab to see if factor VIII or factor IX is the one that is low.
Now, what about when things go wrong later in life? Acquired deficiencies.
Liver disease is the massive one. We mentioned earlier the liver makes almost all the coagulation factors. If the liver fails due to cirrhosis, hepatitis, or alcoholism, the factory simply shuts down. You stop making clotting factors, but you also stop making the regulatory proteins. It's a complete systemic crash.
And then there is the absolute nightmare scenario outlined in the notes, DIC, disseminated intravascular coagulation.
This is truly one of the most feared conditions in medicine. The source describes it as the uncontrolled formation and lysis of fibrin. It's a complete paradox. You are clotting everywhere in your body and bleeding everywhere in your body at the exact same time.
How is that even physically possible? How can you do both?
Imagine a massive trigger. Sepsis from a severe bacterial infection, catastrophic trauma, or certain obstetrical complications like an amniotic fluid embolism. This trigger violently releases tissue factor into the blood system-wide.
So the initial spark is lit everywhere at once, instead of just at a paper cut.
Correct. You start making millions of tiny clots in all your microvasculature, in your fingers, your kidneys, your liver. This is terrible because it blocks blood flow and oxygen to those organs, causing organ failure. But because you are making millions of tiny clots everywhere,
You consume all your platelets and factors.
you use up all your supplies, you run out of bricks and mortar completely. So when the doctor tries to put in an IV line, or if there is a surgical wound, or just from regular vascular wear and tear, you can't clot there. You bleed uncontrollably.
Consumption coagulopathy. You consume the ability to clot.
Exactly. The lab values for DIC are what we call a fire and flood display. Platelets, critically low. Fibrinogen, gone. PT and APTT, prolonged to infinity. And the D-dimer test, strongly positive.
Let's talk about D-dimer. We hear about this test a lot, especially regarding deep vein blood clots in the legs. What is it actually measuring biologically?
D-dimer is a very specific fragment of protein that is only released when cross-linked fibrin is actively chopped up by the body's cleanup crew.
Cross-linked fibrin means a fully stable, finished clot.
Yes. So if a D-dimer is positive, it mathematically proves that a stable clot was formed and is now being broken down, which is called fibrinolysis. In DIC, you have millions of clots forming and breaking down simultaneously, so the D-dimer is sky high.
The source compares DIC to a mimic disease called primary fibrinolysis.
This is a much rarer condition where the enzyme plasmin, which is the cleanup crew supposed to break down old clots, goes totally rogue. It starts chopping up fibrinogen directly before it even becomes a clot.
It's chopping up the raw lumber in the yard, not the finished house.
That's a great analogy. So you have severe bleeding because your fibrinogen is being destroyed. But because no actual fibrin clot was ever formed or cross-linked,
The D-dimer is negative.
is negative.
We're normal.
That is the absolute key differentiator on the boards and in the lab. DIC has a strongly positive D-dimer. Primary fibrinolysis has a negative D-dimer.
That is a crucial distinction because I imagine the treatment must be totally different.
Absolutely opposite. In primary fibrinolysis, you might give specific drugs to stop the breakdown of fibrinogen, like aminocaproic acid.
Yeah.
In DIC, giving those same drugs could be instantly fatal because you desperately need to break down those microclots blocking the organs.
Wow. We've talked a lot about bleeding so far, but as we said at the start, the balance means preventing the other side too. thrombosis, the hyperstate.
Right. We are naturally tilted toward clotting to survive injuries, so the body has to have natural brakes constantly applied to stop the cascade from taking over the world.
The source lists antithrombin, protein C, and protein S as the main brakes.
Antithrombin is like the circulating police officer. It handcuffs the active enzymes, mostly thrombin and SGA, and removes them from circulation. Protein C and protein S are more like saboteurs. They target the cofactors.
The helpers holding the flashlights, 5 and 8.
Yes. Protein C, with help from its buddy protein S, literally chops up factor V and factor 8. It breaks the accelerators. It fundamentally slows the reaction down.
So if your brakes fail,
You crash. You clot. The classic example in the notes is factor V Leiden.
this is a genetic mutation, right? I've actually heard of this one.
It's surprisingly common. In factor V Leiden, the factor V protein has a single amino acid mutation in its structure. It still works perfectly fine as an accelerator. It still helps make clots. But the mutation changes its physical shape, just enough so that protein C cannot grab it and chop it up.
So the saboteur can't catch the accelerator.
Exactly. It is what we call resistant to activated protein C, APCR. The brake pedal simply doesn't connect to the wheel. Factor V keeps accelerating, making more and more thrombin, causing unwanted clots in the legs or lungs. It's the most common cause of hereditary thrombophilia.
And then there's this wild paradox called the lupus anticoagulant.
Oh, this one confuses everyone, even experienced doctors. First of all, the name is terrible. It's a historical misnomer. It's not always associated with lupus, and it's not actually an anticoagulant in the human body.
But in the lab.
In the lab, it severely prolongs the APTT. It makes the test look exactly like you are a bleeder.
Why? How does it trick the test?
Because the lupus anticoagulant is actually a rogue antibody that attacks phospholipids. Now remember, the APTT test is done in an artificial glass tube. We have to add reagents to make it work. One of those critical reagents is a liquid phospholipid substitute to act like the platelet surface.
Oh, so the antibody attacks the test ingredients themselves.
Exactly. It eats up the reagent phospholipid, so the chemical reaction takes forever to happen, resulting in a long APTT.
But in the living body.
In the body, millions of actual platelets provide the phospholipid surface. And platelets are huge and plentiful compared to test reagents. The antibody doesn't stop the clotting on a real platelet. In fact, for reasons that are still being heavily researched, it actually promotes the clotting. It makes the platelets stickier and triggers pathways.
So you have a patient with a scary bleeding lab result, a long APTT, who is actually at extreme risk of a life-threatening blood clot.
Correct. And if you do a mixing study on them, it won't correct because it's an inhibitor eating the reagent. It fits the exact lab profile of a bleeding inhibitor, but clinically it acts like a hypercoagulable state.
That is the ultimate map versus territory warning. If a doctor just treats the lab number, they might kill the patient by withholding blood thinners when the patient actually desperately needs them.
It forces you to treat the patient sitting in front of you, not the number on the paper.
Let's wrap up with the final section, the pre-analytical minefield. This part of the source material seems to be a very stern warning to phlebotomists and nurses. The blue top tube.
The sodium citrate tube, 3.2% concentration. This is the one and only tube we can use for coagulation tests.
Why is the fill volume so critical? The source puts it in bold, all caps letters. Must be 90% full.
This comes down to pure chemistry and ratios. The liquid citrate already inside the vacuum tube prevents clotting by temporarily binding all the calcium in the blood sample. It is calculated precisely to bind the calcium in a very specific amount of blood. The required ratio is exactly 9 parts whole blood to 1 part liquid citrate.
So what happens if you underfill the tube? Say you have a difficult patient, a tough vein, you only get half a tube of blood and you send it to the lab anyway.
Then you have way too much liquid citrate for that small amount of blood. The excess citrate binds all the calcium in the blood and is still hungry. It has unbound chemical receptors left over. When we get it in the lab to run the PT or APTT test, the very first step the machine does is add our own calcium back in to start the timer.
But the hungry citrate left in the tube eats that calcium too.
Exactly. It gobbles up our test reagent calcium instantly. So the blood never clots in the machine, or it takes way too long. It falsely prolongs the PT and APTT.
You might look at that and think the patient is massively overdosed on heparin or warfarin, but really you just didn't fill the plastic tube up to the line.
Correct. You alter their medication based on a plastic tube error, and you could cause a fatal bleed.
And what about the opposite physical problem? Polycythemia.
This is a medical condition where the patient naturally has way too many red blood cells, a hematocrit greater than 55%.
If the blood is mostly packed red cells, that means there is physically very little liquid plasma.
Right. And the liquid citrate only interacts with the plasma, doesn't go into the red blood cells. So if there is significantly less plasma volume in that 9-to-1 draw, the concentration of citrate in that tiny bit of plasma skyrockets.
Same exact problem. It's overcitrated.
Same result. Falsely prolonged tests. In these specific cases, we actually have to do a special calculation, open a fresh tube, remove a calculated amount of citrate with a micropipette, and then draw the patient's blood.
Wow. The precision required is intense. And one last error source listed here, the traumatic draw.
If the phlebotomist is digging around for a vein, we call it probing, you are physically injuring the tissue around the vein with a needle. And what does injured tissue contain?
Tissue factor,
Which is the initial spark.
which activates the extrinsic pathway right there in the needle, so the blood starts clotting before it even gets into the tube.
Yes, this will falsely shorten the test times because the reaction's already jump-started. Or worse, it will cause microscopic clots floating in the tube, which clogs the machines and makes the sample completely useless.
It really just goes to show the diagnosis starts with the literal needle stick. You can have the best, most expensive automated machines in the world, but if the sample is bad, the answer is bad.
Garbage in, garbage out. A bad draw yields bad data, which inevitably leads to bad medical treatment.
So we've gone all the way from the tiny platelet bricks sticking to collagen, to the Roman numeral managers requiring vitamin K, to the theoretical models of cascades versus cells, to the genetic diseases that break the system, and finally, to the literal plastic tubes we collect it all in. It's an incredibly intricate system.
It is. It's a physiological system that lives perpetually on the edge of a knife, balanced perfectly between free flow and solid concrete, usually managing it without a single error for a lifetime.
I think the thing that sticks with me the most is that lupus anticoagulant paradox. The concept that we have an antibody that looks exactly like a bleeder in a glass test tube, but acts like a deadly clotter in a human being.
It really highlights the hard limitations of our modern diagnostic tools. We're trying to replicate a dynamic, living, three-dimensional, cell-based biological storm inside a static plastic tube with some manufactured chemicals. It's honestly amazing we get it right as often as we do.
It forces us to ask a profound question. How much of what we measure in medicine is biological reality? And how much is just an artifact, the tools we use to measure it?
That's exactly the question that keeps hematologists up at night. And it should keep everyone questioning the absolute certainty of lab values.
Well, on that provocative note, I want to leave the listener with this. Next time you get a bruise or a random paper cut, just take a second to appreciate the frantic, perfectly choreographed, microscopic construction crew rushing to save your life. They are the unsung heroes of your physiology.
They're working hard for you right now, keeping everything in balance.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive into hemostasis. It's been a bloody good time. See you next time.